Hi Anatomy, welcome back. Today is Monday, April 27th. It is hard to believe that it is already the end of April here. Up to this point, hopefully you've been tracking with all of these videos and getting a better understanding of the complexity of the cardiovascular system. And so as I mentioned at the end of the previous video, today we are going to be tackling the heart anatomy. So on the screen behind me, you can actually see this is the external heart anatomy. So all of the features that are visible without cutting open the heart. And something to note, if you didn't already know this or pick up on this through your reading and the previous lessons that we have done, but the left and right side of the heart are opposite. So when you're labeling a heart, it's going to be opposite of your whatever hand you're writing with, because the labels do not go by which side you are on, they go by the direction of the person who owns the heart. So it's reversed when we're labeling the heart. So just pay attention to that, because it's a really common mistake for students to put the, say that this is the left ventricle and this is the right atrium and so on and so forth. All right. And so this picture is from your book, and we're going to be going over some of these structures in the next few slides here, but make sure that you are referencing back to this image and getting a good understanding of where all of these external features are. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the fact that the heart from the external side as well as the internal side has 4 chambers. Okay, and you may have heard of these before, but you have 2 atria, and you have 2 ventricles. The atria have very thin walls, and both right and left have flap-like extensions that are called auricles. Okay, and these auricles slightly increase the capacity of each of these atriums, or of each atria. Okay, and the ventricles, on the other hand, those have very thick walls. So the atria have thinner walls while the ventricles have thick walls. Okay, and the atria sit on top and the ventricles sit on the bottom. So if you go back to look at that image, you can see that. I always remembered it because A for atria is first in the alphabet, so it sits up top and it's first, and then below it is the ventricle. And again, being careful to make sure that you have labeled left and right ventricle and atria correctly. Again, it's opposite, and it has to do with the person who owns the heart. Additionally, from the 4 chambers of the heart, there are several major veins that bring blood into the heart. The first is the superior vena cava, and it brings deoxygenated blood from the upper body tissues to the right atrium. So any of the blood that is lacking oxygen and therefore needs it, that is coming from the upper body tissues, is going to be brought into the heart by the superior vena cava. And additionally, we also have the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the opposite direction. Instead of from the upper body tissues, the inferior vena cava brings the deoxygenated blood from the lower body tissues into the right atrium. All right, and so we will be talking more at the end of this video about the flow of blood through the heart, but you can see here that both the superior and inferior vena cava dump their deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Okay. Atria means entrance, so again, if that helps you to remember that blood flows into the atria, it enters into the entrance before it's going to go into the ventricle, which actually means belly. Okay, continuing with some of the main veins and blood vessels of the heart, there are 4 pulmonary veins that we have. You have 2 left pulmonary veins and 2 right pulmonary veins. And as I'm always trying to give you some sort of way to help remember and understand where things go, again, pulmonary or pulm here, that prefix has to do with the lungs. So as you can guess, these 2 are going to be bringing blood from the lungs. Okay, so what they do is they are going to take the oxygenated blood from the lungs and bring it to the left atrium. Okay, then you have additionally two large arteries that carry blood away from the heart. Again, remember, veins bring blood to the heart, while arteries bring blood away. Arteries away. Okay, and so the first is the pulmonary trunk, which is going to carry deoxygenated blood out the right ventricle towards the lungs. Okay, and the pulmonary trunk also divides into right and left pulmonary arteries. And the pulmonary arteries, again, away. The right and left pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood to the respective lungs. So the right pulmonary artery is going to bring deoxygenated blood to the right lung, and the left pulmonary artery is going to bring deoxygenated blood to the left lung. Okay, and then another structure that you've probably heard of before, the aorta. Okay, and this exits the left ventricle and carries oxygenated blood to the tissues. And so you have a descending and an ascending portion. So the descending and the ascending go up and down respectively. Additionally, there are arteries and veins that run across the surface of the heart, and you will see that in the future, but these are smaller arteries and veins that run across the surface, and these supply the oxygen and nutrients to the heart, because again, the heart itself is a muscle, right? And we know that if it's a muscle and it's a tissue and it has cells, it's going to need oxygen and nutrients just like any other tissue or cell in the body does. And so these arteries and veins supply the much needed oxygen, blood, and nutrients. And they together form what we call coronary circulation. So coronary circulation for the heart, this is just the circulation that supplies the heart with what it needs to do its job, which is ultimately to supply the rest of the body with the blood and nutrients that it needs. Okay, and so this next image is the internal view, and you can see some of the main things that we just talked about even on this internal view, like the aorta here, okay, and the superior vena cava. But this is now looking at the inside, okay, so we have the atrium up here and the ventricle down here, and same on this side. We have an atrium up here and a ventricle down here, okay, and so continuing on and looking at our internal anatomy now, the major structures that are visible from the inside, you have, like we said, the right atrium, and this is where we receive deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Okay, and the coronary sinus, you might be asking, is the major vein returning deoxygenated blood from the heart muscle itself. Okay, and so the right atrium opens up into the right ventricle. Remember I said it sits on top. I like to think of A being first in the alphabet. So the atrium sits on top and the ventricle sits below. And it opens into the right ventricle through what's called the right atrioventricular valve, or the AV canal, sometimes also called the tricuspid valve. So any of these names is appropriate, the right AV valve or canal or the tricuspid valve. And this valve is very important as it ensures one-way travel of blood through the canal. You wouldn't want blood to be backflowing into areas that it shouldn't be. You want it to flow and go where it needs to go properly. And it's composed of 3 sheets of thin connective tissue, and it opens and closes based on the pressure differences that arise during contraction and relaxation of your heart. Okay, so this valve is opening and closing continuously with different pumps and with different contractions and relaxations. Something called the papillary muscles connect the valve via really strong, thin-like threads that we call chordae tendineae, or heartstrings. So if you've heard someone say the classic phrase like, oh, you're tugging on my heartstrings, that's where this name comes from. There really are heartstrings. And you're going to see this in future video lessons more clearly. Okay? All right. Continuing on, those same papillary muscles that we just said, they are going to contract when the ventricle contracts. Okay, so when that lower portion contracts. And this prevents the AV valve from opening into the atrium. Okay, and so ultimately allowing the blood to flow up the pulmonary trunk, and instead of going backwards into the right atrium. And admittedly, guys, understanding the circulation of blood in the heart anatomy, this is not the most effective way to learn this. Ultimately, a dissection is going to be the most effective way to learn and see this for yourself. And so we are making plans right now to work that out, so at least you can get some better exposure rather than just reading the path that blood takes through the heart. Okay? So continuing on now into the left atrium. So now we've already been through the right atrium and the right ventricle as well as the valve, and now we're in the left atrium, which receives oxygenated blood from 4 pulmonary veins. Okay, remember we said that those veins are bringing blood from the lungs because you've breathed in oxygen. So now that blood is oxygenated, and now it's going to come back to the heart through the left atrium via the 4 pulmonary veins. And they're separated from the left ventricle by the left atrioventricular valve, or the AV valve. And this one is also called the bicuspid or mitral valve. So any 3 of these terms is suitable to describe the valve that is on in between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And this is made up of 2 sheets of connective tissue. So the last valve we just said was the tricuspid valve, and I said it was made of 3 sheets. So 3 sheets. The bicuspid valve is made up of 2 sheets of connective tissue. And this opens also in response to pressure changes, and it allows the blood to flow from the left atrium into the right ventricle. And it closes off when the ventricle contracts, again, to prevent the backflow of blood, which is a very important feature. Okay, and the left ventricle now sits directly below the left atrium, and the left ventricle, empties into the aorta. Okay, and in between now the left and right atria and the left and right ventricle, we have what's called the interventricular septum and the interarterial septum. Okay, and so the interventricular septum, ventricular, it divides the right and left ventricles completely, whereas the interatrial septum divides the left and right atriums. Okay, and again, much like the ventricles themselves, the ventricles are much thicker than the atria, and the same is true for the septum for each, because the interatrial septum is much thinner than the interventricular septum. All right. Additionally, we have another important valve that's called the semilunar valve, and it separates the aorta and pulmonary trunk from the ventricles. Okay. It meets in the center of the vessel to block blood from flowing, and so the blood flow out of the ventricles pushes against the valve and causes it to open. And this is a one-way valve. Most are. And it ensures that blood never flows back into the heart once it is pushed out, because that would be very, very bad. So this is a one-way system. Okay, and now if we trace all of these internal and external features, we can actually track exactly where the blood has gone. Okay, and so again, take a second look at this, refer back to it, or look in your book as we discuss the flow of blood, because this will give you a better understanding of exactly where this blood is going or not going. And if you didn't know this already, these images are always drawn in red and blue, blue being for deoxygenated blood, with red being the oxygenated blood. So if you see red, this is blood that has already been to the lungs and has oxygen molecules in it, whereas blue is headed to the lungs to get oxygen. Okay? And so once blood has derived its oxygen, delivered its oxygen to the various body tissues, as I said, it's deoxygenated. It's already given up its oxygen, and now it needs to travel back to the heart in the veins, where it can get ready to be oxygenated again in the lungs. And so the blood will travel back to the heart, to the veins, and enter into the right atrium via the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, or the coronary sinus, and it will flow into the right atrium. Once the atrium is full, it's going to contract, and that blood will flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Okay, and once it enters into the right ventricle is going to contract itself, And that is going to force the blood into the pulmonary trunk. And backflow, again, is prevented by closing of the tricuspid valve. And the right ventricle now can relax as that blood is forced into the pulmonary trunk, and backflow is prevented by closing of the pulmonary semilunar valve. All right, the blood that enters into the pulmonary trunk, remember this is deoxygenated, is going to travel into the pulmonary arteries. Okay, and the pulmonary arteries are going to take that blood to the left and right lungs respectively. And the left and right lungs are going to oxygenate the blood in the pulmonary capillaries as we breathe in the oxygen. Once it's oxygenated, that blood is going to return to the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. Okay, and from the pulmonary veins, that oxygenated blood enters into the left atrium now, and the left atrium contracts, much like the right atrium had contracted before. And this forces the blood through the bicuspid valve into the right ventricle. So you can kind of see a pattern. It's reversed between the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. But now we have a left ventricle that's ready to contract because the blood has been forced through the bicuspid valve and into the left ventricle. And so as this happens, as the left ventricle contracts, this forces the blood out of the aorta into the aortic semilunar valve. And the bicuspid valve will now close, preventing the backflow into the atrium once again. At this point now, the left ventricle is able to relax because it's already contracted and pushed that blood flow, and this relaxation prevents the backflow of blood into the left ventricle. It's important to note that both the right and the left atrium contract at the same time, and both the right and left ventricles contract at the same time. So this is not like a this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. This is continuously happening in all of the atria and ventricle at the same time. There's hardly a split second between the left and the right contractions in the heart. Okay, so this is a constant dum 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 pumping motion of opening, contracting, relaxing, opening, contracting, relaxing, and so on and so forth. All right, and so this last image, there's plenty of these available online too, and some videos if you would like to refer to some blood flow diagrams. But again, the blue and the red represent the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood and the path that we just outlined. Okay, so that blood coming in through the superior and inferior vena cava is deoxygenated. It enters into the right atrium, passes through the tricuspid valve here, and into the right ventricle before it is pushed out and out through the pulmonary trunk to go and get oxygenated at the lungs, either or of the lungs. Once oxygenated, that blood is going to come back in through the pulmonary veins, enter into the left atrium, pass through the bicuspid valve, and enter into the left ventricle before being pushed up into the aorta and brought to the different parts of the body, either the ascending or descending portion. All right, and so that concludes the flow of blood through the heart. For your next video on Wednesday, there will not be a recorded video for this. Instead, I am going to be sending out a link for a heart dissection that was done on a cow by a professor at another university. It's the best I could find online, but seeing as we are likely going to miss the opportunity to dissect a cow heart, I feel like watching this video of the dissection is as close as we're going to get given the circumstances. So check your email. There will not be a new video for Wednesday, but you will have an assignment to watch that dissection and answer some questions that you're going to email to me in regards to some of the things that were covered in that video. All right, and so with that, I will be posting a link below for you to check out on the heart flow and the heart anatomy that we have just discussed, and I highly encourage you to do so. All right, I will see you in the next video on Friday.